Thank you, Swelly, and thank you to the Brazil-Florida Business Council for allowing us to present this topic. Again, my name is Morgan Geller. Before I turn it over to Krista, here we have essentially a visual of all the different parties and all the different steps that the food supply chain is comprised of. From the beginning, production, growing, through transportation and distribution, which has been significantly affected due to travel restrictions and restrictions on immigrant labor, which has again affected the delivery system throughout the end. And then on the end side, we have the retail and consumer markets. And later on, I'll get into the differences between the retail sector and the consumer sector and why those differences have had such an impact on the changes that we're seeing.
Great, thanks Morgan. So I wanted to take a step back and look at the big picture before we get into more detail and actual estimates for impacts to agriculture in the US and in Florida. So just, you know, with respect to COVID-19 emergence and mitigation, this is a situation that we really haven't experienced in our lifetimes before. So some of the public health measures that were put in place to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 are things like travel restrictions. So we're seeing decreases in tourist spending in a lot of economies that are sort of dependent or even heavily dependent on tourist spending. Non-essential business closures, so there's altered patterns of consumer spending on goods generally, including food. And also social distancing and stay-at-home orders. So these, we're seeing decreases in institutional demand. So there may have been things like cafeterias in office buildings or at universities, even the public school system shutting down. Altered food consumption patterns at home. You know, before in the US, prior to COVID-19, individuals were spending more than 50% of their money on food away from home, and now we're seeing that they're going to grocery stores much more often and preparing that food at home, as these places are limited capacity. They can take fewer customers in, maybe they're pickup delivery only, or they might even be shut down for their own safety on their own decision. Next slide, please. So just to take a step back before we look at some of the estimates for the food service industry, we're seeing a lot of estimates come out from all industries on changes in sales revenues due to the COVID-19 situation. So things like new car sales in March and April have declined by 52%. Domestic flights being taken are expected to decline between 28 and 51%. International flights 38 to 71%. And you know, these, as we're saying that, you know, the food system is complex, the food system is even just part of the larger economic system. So we're going to see connections and domino effects coming to the food system from impacts in other sectors, as well as impacts in the food system playing out in other sectors of the economy as well. Just a few estimates here, though, on the food service industry. So, you know, the once $300 billion US food service industry has declined by 60 to 90% here, with grocery shopping exponentially increasing. And, you know, it's expected that by the end of 2020, that 50% of US consumers will have tried online grocery shopping services, which is a big difference from prior to this situation beginning. Next slide. So if we take a step, you know, if we narrow just a little bit further, our research program is actually on Florida's food system, and we've created this graphic here to show exactly what Morgan was showing in the graphic before, that there's these links between production of food through to processing and manufacturing of food products. And then we really get split off at the bottom into two different ways to distribute food to consumers. Consumers going to places to eat away from home, which is depicted there at the bottom, and then the grocery farmers market type chain where they're purchasing food to prepare at home. So if I describe Florida's food system as a whole, we're actually pretty unique even within the United States. The growers and fishers in Florida produce an estimated 200 to 300 different commodities. Agriculture is actually present in all 67 counties of Florida. And it's a good reminder that production agriculture is only one piece of the complex food system here. Next slide. I'll talk a little bit first prior to getting into COVID-19 impacts on the economic importance of Florida's food system. And these numbers, while they're specific to Florida, it rings true in most states and in the United States as well as other countries that this sector is an important part of the economy as well as being important to provide food to everyone. So it looks like I've repeated some of this information here, but we put out an annual report from the Economic Impact Analysis to describe the economic importance of the food system. Next slide. So if we look only at the crops, livestock, forestry, and fishing, so that production agriculture piece, they're actually responsible for $10 billion in sales every year. That's sales to consumers in Florida as well as the rest of the US and around the world. And directly employed in these sectors are 137,790 jobs. Those are both full-time and part-time jobs. Next slide. And this doesn't look like the final version. So the food processing and manufacturing, here we've got $31 billion in sales and an additional 76,146 jobs. Next slide. And then this final piece where we're talking about food distribution is actually the largest piece in terms of sales and jobs, where we see $101 billion in sales and 1.2 million jobs supported in this sector. But Morgan mentioned that domino effect at the very beginning, so it doesn't really stop there. So the numbers that I just shared are people and sales that are coming directly from the food system, but the food system is actually supporting activity in other sectors through the purchases of input goods and services, as well as the spending of income by employees in both those directly and indirectly supported sectors. So if we calculate a multiplier effect for these industries, we actually see $137 billion of value added contributions to Florida's economy. So that's over 13% of the gross state product for the state, and 2.26 million jobs supported, which is just under 19% of all jobs in the state of Florida. So one other program that we have that began after Hurricane Irma is disaster impact assessment. So there are different state-of-the-art tools used around the world and in the US for estimating the cost of disasters that look economy-wide at things like electricity not being available, so businesses are shut down, income not being spent, but very few of them have much focus or even an inclusion of agriculture. So in 2017, we started really thinking about how things like natural disasters impact agriculture and the food system. And we were asked to do this again for the COVID-19 situation, even though we're typically talking about things like hurricanes, floods, freeze events. Next slide. So when we were asked to assess the impacts of COVID-19, I actually initially shied away a little bit. Asking me to predict the outcome of a black swan event in the middle of a black swan event was a little bit daunting, but we finally decided that we do have to do something to try to communicate how our food system in Florida is being impacted. So we created a set of online survey instruments that are similar to the process we go through in natural disasters, but we've extended them to cover things like production agriculture, post-harvest processing, agricultural transportation, as well as marine-based sectors, so commercial fishing, the seafood wholesale dealers, and all of the industries that are involved in marine recreation. We collected responses only for the period between April 16th and May 15th and asked about impacts that they had seen to date from the COVID-19 situation. Next slide. So just to give you a very brief view of overall participation, we got 729 responses from agricultural operations all around the state, and the the colors here on the map, the more responses that we received from that particular county. In terms of commercial fishing, we received 319 responses, and you'll see that a majority of those are on those coastal counties where the fish are coming in. Next slide. So, just to stay brief on time, we collected a whole lot more information about how the business operations were changing, changes in employment situations, changes in the types of goods and products delivered, or how employees were working on job sites. But what I'll share with you today is the results for changes in sales revenue across these different commodity groups. So you can see here along the bottom, these are the different commodity groups that we collected information for, ranging from field crops to horticultural crops, vegetables, melons, potatoes, fruits, and nuts. And the blue lines that you see are the full range of responses that we received from operations that are involved in those commodity groups. So if you look, almost all of them had an extremely wide range of responses for what was happening, from negative 100% all the way up to a positive 98%, that certain operations are actually doing much better during this situation. But if we take the average, you'll see the green bars on each of these lines is the average for that particular commodity group. And on average, all of them have declines in sales revenue. Next slide, please. So we can look further at certain commodities that we actually had enough responses for within those commodity groups. So I'll take, for example, here the livestock and aquaculture commodity group. There were two commodities that we received quite a few responses for, that we were able to dig into them specifically. One is beef cattle, and the other is clams and oysters, so shellfish aquaculture. And you can see that even though that particular category was showing about 30 to 40% decline in the slide previously, there's even a wide range of impacts of what's going on for specific commodities within those groups, where the shellfish aquaculture is experiencing on average a 75% decline. And the beef cattle, again, has that wide range where some are doing very well and some are not doing quite as well. So we're able to take all of this information that we got and secondary data on how much we know these particular commodity groups are worth in a normal year. So you can see in the first column here, we have total annual sales revenues, which is a 5-year average, because we don't want to take, we don't want to only compare them to what they were doing business last year. 2018, we had Hurricane Michael. 2017, we had Hurricane Irma. A lot of the sectors that we were looking at in 2019 actually were experiencing some harmful algal blooms. So we took a 5-year average to generate the amount of activity that we were expecting on a regular year for these commodity groups, and then looked at some information on what percentage of that annual revenue normally happens in the period that they've been experiencing impacts from COVID-19. So you can see, production agriculture is seasonal. So not all of these, some of these were in sort of peak production season, and some of them were just being planted or just starting to come off the field, and they'll be impacted, the revenue will be impacted in different ways depending on what part of that process they were in. So we've calculated essentially the output at risk, what did we expect them to make during this period, and then use those percentage losses from the survey with a range on confidence intervals there to estimate that we're to date estimating about $894 million of losses in this production agriculture sector in the state of Florida. And to give you an idea, that's only slightly smaller than the impact we saw from Hurricane Irma. Next slide. So just very briefly, commercial fishing, we estimated slightly differently. We have information on monthly landings for what comes in, and we were able to look at how respondents were being impacted across the months there with the estimated change in revenue, and calculated the total revenue loss of about $25 million for commercial fishing. So just, this is a very brief look at what we've been able to do so far, and there's a lot behind those sales revenue changes, right? We're seeing changes in demand, a little bit of changes in supply for some of the inputs that they're able to get. And it all comes back to this food supply chain, as well as coming out of the food supply chain, and in how these sectors are connected with the rest of the economy. And one thing going wrong in one sector will have that domino effect that Morgan talked about. But when all of these sectors are being impacted by the same shock at the same time, it's really thrown us for a loop in a lot of different things that happened. So I'll pass it back to you, Morgan.
Thank you, Krista. Some really great information. So now, as Krista has showed us and demonstrated the economic impacts of COVID-19 on our food supply chain and the different industries, especially in the state of Florida, I'm going to cover more about the actual impacts we've seen in terms of the logistics side of it, and what kind of innovations and technologies have been coming out of what otherwise, is a disaster. Perhaps COVID-19 can be the black swan of 2020. So the heart of the issue with the food supply chain that we've been seeing from COVID-19 lies in the heart of what I was talking about before, of the differences between getting food to the institutional types of customers, such as hospitals, restaurants, and whatnot, which, because of social distancing and government orders, have no customers to service. So the producers, farmers, and other steps in the chain have nowhere to send these raw materials. And because of the logistical differences, these raw materials can't easily be rerouted. So how can companies and different aspects of the food supply chain help mitigate these otherwise negative effects, and how can they, and what have we been seeing in terms of an effective response? So first, a lesson learned has certainly been risk management and business continuity strategies are extremely important, because obviously no one could have predicted COVID-19, but there should be some risk management plan in the sense of, in case a hurricane hits, in case there is some kind of catastrophic disaster, and diversifying your supply chain can help find and source alternative routes to deliver your products and to source your products as well. So historically, the food supply chain in our country has been rather predictive. Grocery stores have been able to analyze data in the past, especially these larger companies, to predict consumers' behavior, how much they need to order, how much consumers are going to purchase. When something like a pandemic hits, all of that data is essentially useless. And what was otherwise a just-in-time food supply chain can no longer work. And that's what we saw, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, when there were extreme shortages across national chains and grocery stores. I think in the past couple months, companies and grocery stores and supply chain companies have gotten better at that, but there's still definite problems. So what can companies do in order to mitigate and respond to these? Our supply chain needs to be more flexible and less rigid in the future. Oftentimes, these large conglomerates and large companies view their data as proprietary to them. So consumer behavior has value, and that data has been used historically in leveraging power and negotiating contracts. So something that a lot of experts have touched upon is that this is where blockchain comes in, and I'll get into it later, that this data should be free, and the supply chain needs to have complete transparency so that each link in the chain can react appropriately and everyone knows what everyone else is doing in the supply chain. It's like a large company in a hierarchy. If oftentimes as a lawyer, we have a joke, the lawyers are usually the last ones to know. So if everyone knows what's going on, everyone can work together to address these types of problems that we've been seeing. So again, this is what I've been talking about. And single suppliers and single geographical dependencies have been a big problem as a result of COVID-19. And what we've been seeing is a lot of consumers have been gravitating towards local suppliers as a way to have access to more ingredients and even safer ingredients. So farmers, for example, have been eliminating the middleman, selling direct to consumers. I personally joined a CSA and I get my produce delivered, doesn't touch the grocery store, doesn't get any packaging, so it's safer that way. And that has been something that companies have been advertising to consumers as well. So, I always say if there's a way where you can turn something bad and create reputational goodwill from it, definitely leverage those opportunities. And so this is COVID-19 in the US food service industry. This slide essentially, I think we've pretty much talked about this. I do want to touch upon something from the legal sense as it relates to the food service industry. I've been getting a lot of questions about employee safety, consumer safety, and liability. And obviously, when you're dealing with factory workers, migrant laborers, truck drivers, and all of these essential employees that are pivotal to delivering the food, making the food, processing the food, as a company, there is a sense of responsibility, there is a legal obligation to make sure that you are, in fact, keeping your employees safe and that your products are being processed and grown and delivered in a safe way as well. And, that's something that I think we'll see changing, and especially from the legal side, even to address some of the issues of the differences between the retail sector and the consumer sector. We've seen the government act quickly to implement some food labeling flexibilities. So it'll be interesting to see how the laws progress in that space. So here is the heart of what I've been looking into in terms of the heart of this problem that we as a country and as a globe, since we're all interdependent in one another, we import and export items, and I don't think that's going to stop. But like I said, so we have the food service supply chain and the retail and grocery supply. Restaurants order in bulk, and I'm not even talking about Costco or Sam's Club. The amount, let's say a carton of eggs that gets delivered to a restaurant would be even too large to sell in Costco. And as a result, the food labeling, nutritional information aren't the same as what a consumer is required to have in a product that it purchases in the grocery. So those eggs, those packages of meat weren't legally able to be sold at a grocery store. So that was one initial problem. Second, due to travel restrictions, there have been a lot of rerouting of products. Or products aren't able to get delivered to where they are because of these restrictive contracts that exist between the different parties within the supply chain. So as a farmer, someone, if you are a cattle farmer, if the plant that processes your meat is closed, you don't have the means to butcher that cow and package it and put it in a way that it can be sold to grocery stores or restaurants. So what's happening is that these farmers, and that are, I've actually gone online and I've seen you can buy a whole cow or a half a cow. But at the end of the day, there's just this excess of inventory in terms of fruits, vegetables, animals, and to continue to keep those animals alive is a significant cost. And at some point, you miss that window of opportunity. So that's what's happening. And I think, especially in the nonprofit sector and food banks, and I think we as a country are becoming more in tune with where our food comes from. I'm optimistic that we'll see some changes in the near future. So this is a map that shows how our food actually flows in the United States between counties. So, you can see, especially in California, a lot of produce comes from there, but how far it travels. It's really astonishing how interconnected we all are in order to get these commodities and raw materials. And so this is what we've seen about how can we move forward? How can we use this as an opportunity to innovate? And for me, if we can reduce that level of dependency on other states, other countries, I think there's a real opportunity to have a truly, sustainable way of consuming food. Even we're seeing, especially in the agriculture and produce, urban farms, so cities that may not have been able to provide produce to their people and had to get it from other states. We're seeing companies grow produce in shipping containers, hydroponic farms. So I think that's only going to continue from here. And it's a way to build a sense of community as well. So something that I've looked into, and I'm going to go through a couple examples of some of these new companies that we've seen. So there's a push to centralize this data. And I'm saying the data across all segments of the supply chain. And we have been seeing this larger push for a more digital way of ordering and delivering. These are two examples which I was able to find and have been written up. So Choco, it was actually based out of Berlin, formed in 2018. It creates one single platform where all restaurants and suppliers can do all sourcing and all ordering via their app without having to pick up phone. So if you need to find a supplier for a specific ingredient, you do it via the app. And this not only allows efficiency, but it allows diversification, and this is what I was talking about, moving away from the single supplier model. And then the other example I have here is a company called Fieldcraft, and it's essentially an online grocery store for all buyers and suppliers in the food supply chain. So I think this is just the beginning of this trend, and definitely technology has been playing a huge part in this innovation in the food supply chain. And so what we're likely to see is moving away from this type of traditional model, which is linear, into a digital supply network where we have all of the data housed, and everyone is linked together, but in a good way this time. So this now brings us to blockchain technology. So I think most people obviously have heard of blockchain in the concept of Bitcoin, but blockchain in itself is a technology that can be used far beyond the realm of just Bitcoin. It has been used, especially by some large companies and some pilot studies, in order to trace food and detect not only foodborne illnesses, which especially is important when we're researching how pandemics or how illnesses originate and where they originate, but it also allows for a complete and open forum for data. And the way that blockchain works is the users upload their own data, but no one owns the data. If you upload it, it's your data, you own it, and it allows for a sense of accountability and a unified system. So an example is here. This is essentially the way the blockchain can help. So companies have been utilizing QR codes actually to track food. So let's say, food goes to a plant, to a truck. At each step in that process, that QR code will be scanned so that each piece of food, each package is traced appropriately. And the IBM Food Trust has actually been something that's been pivotal in this area. Some of the early adopters include Walmart and Dole, and the Food Trust utilizes blockchain technology to create essentially a more sustainable food system. So the way it works is that it digitizes all transactions and includes everyone in the process, from growers, processors, shippers, consumers, and regulators. The way that this technology works is it's expanding our food system rather than hindering it. And the way our old way of growing, delivering, and selling food has been rigid and has hindered innovation. And I think with this new technology, it's just going to make our food more healthy, sustainable, and hopefully we can avoid foodborne illnesses in the future. So this is somewhat blurry, but I wanted to find a good image of how this actually works in practice. So I found this data quite interesting. So 420,000 people die from foodborne illnesses each year. And only 1 in 4 consumers trust today's food supply chain and trust their food source. So those numbers to me are staggering. And I think with blockchain technology to handle and ensure traceability, freshness, certification, who buys those products, it's really going to allow for a lot more communication, a lot more cooperation, I think, and teamwork across all the different participants of the food supply chain as well. And Krista, I welcome you to join in on anything about closing thoughts. But I think what the coronavirus has done, not only with the food supply chain, but across all sectors, has really brought the industry together. We're seeing people and companies innovate in ways that we've never seen. Restaurants are creating meal kits, doing virtual cooking classes. You see a lot more people coming together as a family, cooking at home. And, I think the consumption at home versus offsite consumption is is not going anywhere. And I think, actually, I know that companies are still pivoting. So, certainly I don't think we're going to go back to our normal pre-COVID-19 eating out anytime soon, really. One thing is governments allowing it. The other is consumer behavior and consumers actually feeling comfortable. And, even in Miami, a large city, I still don't see anything nearly as the way it was before. So now is where we will get to the questions and answers. And
Mark, and I'll jump in because I think two of the questions that have come in are related to a closing that I was going to make. Anyway, so we've talked a lot about this. There's a trade-off between efficiency and resiliency, right? And I think that that's finally able to rear its face, maybe let's say in the food supply chain, because in past situations where a disaster has affected one area, then we're able to logistically get around that and provide food in from other areas while that particular local area might be down for weeks or maybe months, but not months at a time that everybody is experiencing the same type of situation. So two questions came in about what is the federal state government doing to mitigate losses suffered by participants in the food supply chain. And then there's a second question with some information about how we've seen some of these changes happening where the food supply chain, people are now buying things to consume at home from a restaurant and using a restaurant as sort of a food at home outlet versus just going in to get prepared food to eat at home. And I think it all comes, whether or not these things are allowed or working, all comes back to kind of policy around incentivizing resilience in the food chain. So on the production side, there have been a couple government efforts and trying to provide relief to producers that are experiencing some of this loss in, having to cull the animals or disc under the crops. But any time that these one-time disaster relief payments are needed, they're always insufficient. They don't really always stretch out across the entire food supply chain when something like COVID-19 happens. And I think it's going to be one of those things where not only are we seeing these changes on the business side, but on the policy side, we really need to review those existing policies and recovery tools so that we can find a way to decrease or prevent that need for one-time special allocations and incentivize the food system to be more resilient. Adopting strategies that can counteract potential compounding impacts of disasters too. So on production agriculture, if you're hit by a hurricane year after year after year, the chance for sectoral growth and development goes down significantly. And I think we're sort of prepping for the potential for compound disasters in the same year as we come into hurricane season during COVID-19. So just, a reminder that we've got to have effective policy as well as this thought process for the businesses to become more resilient as well.
So Krista and Morgan, we got a lot of good questions, and I have selected some of them because of the lack of time. So I have here for you, Krista, is there anything different from an agricultural economics perspective that you were seeing with the pandemic?
Yeah, I think that, normally when we're doing disaster impact assessment, it's a big shock to the supply side. A hurricane comes through and knocks all of the oranges off of a tree and does so in the same way for every orange grove. But with COVID-19, it's much more this significant shock in demand that has trickled all the way back to the growers, and it's impacting growers differently. If you were someone that sold everything into the processing sector, which then went to, say, the airlines or the cruise ships, then demand dried up almost overnight, and there was nothing to do in order to rearrange those to go to a different situation overnight. Some have found ways around that. At this point, we're months into the disaster, but with a perishable product that only has that small window of when you can get it to the market, and some of the things that Morgan talked about with respect to packaging and labeling and how all of that has to take place. I think that's a very different thing that people aren't used to going through. That they've had to shift overnight how they do things, and some were able to do it, and unfortunately some were not.
Very good. And how are you following up on the research that you are the leader into how COVID-19 affected food-related industries?
Sure. So we have a couple things going on. When we ask people for quantitatively how were you impacted, we get a number, but we don't really know what's going on behind that number. So one thing that we're doing now, we've just jumped off on more of a qualitative interview process with a lot of people throughout the food supply chain. So all the way from the growers to the retail operations, to see, kind of collect those stories behind what was happening to them and use that in a qualitative manner to see what worked and what didn't work in this situation, and how can we make these particular sectors more resilient in the future. The other thing that we'll do is follow up in August with another round of the quantitative survey to see, we cut off on May 15th to be able to assess some numbers, but we're certainly still being impacted beyond May 15th. With the sectors that we've already assessed, and the new sectors will come online as different harvest seasons take place. So we'll reassess those beginning in August.
Excellent. We are going to look forward to receiving the result of your next follow-up survey. And what is, Krista, the biggest misconception from the public on food supply chain related issues during the COVID-19?
So I think it's this, the piece we've walked through time and again now on how the food gets to your plate. And, people were very upset to see farmers disking up crops when there were shortages in the grocery store, or there were food banks that didn't have enough of this fresh produce. But remembering that, taking care of those crops in the field while trying to find an alternate market costs a lot of money. And a producer didn't know if that alternate market would show up in time, as well as this whole packaging and labeling differences between selling into a wholesale market versus going to retailers. Oftentimes it's even if a food bank wanted to purchase these items, they don't have the cold storage capacity in order to keep them good and get them out to where they need to go. So just, I think, knowing where their food comes from, a lot of people have been much more informed now than they were 3 months ago.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, I think I think as a result of this, anger or frustration, a lot of consumers have disregarded their previous brand loyalties and have really started diversifying where they get their food from, and sourcing their own supplies and products like a business would, in terms of looking online, perhaps ordering wild fish from Maine or whatnot. And these large brands have always relied on those regular consumers that buy the products time after time again. And the consumer behavior, as far as the products that a family buys week after week, is not as predictable as it was before. So that's a challenge that on the brand side and the corporate side that companies have been tasked with as well.
That's interesting, because the next question is, what kinds of long-term changes do you see could we see in the food industry habits?
Well, consumer behavior, I think, is obviously one. I think what Krista was mentioning about, before, people may not have cared or been so in tune of where their food came from. But I think now more than ever, we're all very, very in tune in terms of the farms, the bodies of water, the factories where our food's coming from. And I think there's going to be a growing trend towards buying local and sustainable foods. And that's been a trend already, but I think the coronavirus and the pandemic is just going to accelerate that growing trend. And then on the business side, I think, and especially in the food service industry, I think employee and worker safety is going to be prioritized more so than it was before. And I think consumers are a lot more aware of the sanitation and the cleanliness of our food and how it's made and delivered to us as well.
Yeah, but we live in a global economy. So what about the food safety issue? Because one of the questions that I have here, how the companies can do more to assure the origins, identify and the traceability of their goods.
I think that's where the advent of these new technologies is going to come into play. Not only blockchain, but just a concept of a transparent, free and open food supply chain that all works together. I think the transparency and the ability to adapt is the most important going forward. With food traceability and food safety, the increase of technology to scan the QR codes and know exactly where any given item has been and is going to be and who has consumed it, because that can not only, that has extreme health benefits from a foodborne illness risk and mitigating that risk as well.